It was a quiet afternoon in a small town, the kind where nothing ever seems out of place. A veteran, someone who had given years of his life to the military, was standing by the side of the road. His face was lined with years of service, his eyes tired, but still full of determination. He was waiting for a bus just like any other person would, but today was different. A police officer, patrolling the streets, noticed him standing there. The officer slowed his car and stared. His eyes narrowed, not with concern, but with judgment. There was something about the veteran that seemed to irritate him. Maybe it was the worn-out jacket the man wore, or the way his hands fidgeted. Whatever it was, it made the officer decide to stop and approach. The veteran didn't see it coming. He didn't expect trouble. He had seen enough in his life, enough to know when to keep his head down. But this time, he wasn't prepared for the hostility that was about to come his way. What started as a simple encounter between a man waiting for a bus and a police officer would soon escalate into something much bigger. The veteran had no idea that his day was about to change forever. The man standing by the road was no stranger to hardship. His name was Thomas, and he had spent nearly 2 decades in the military. He had seen places most people would never dream of, and experienced things that changed him forever. His uniform had once been crisp and sharp, but now the edges were worn and the creases had softened with time. Thomas had enlisted when he was just out of high school, eager to serve his country. Over the years he had fought in foreign lands, witnessing both the horrors and the heroism that war could bring. His comrades had become his family, and the battlefield had become his home. But when the time came to leave, the world he returned to was nothing like he had imagined. Coming back home had been harder than the battles he fought overseas. The transition wasn't easy. He struggled with adjusting to a civilian life that felt foreign, a life where his experiences didn't seem to fit. Finding a job was a challenge. People didn't understand him. They didn't understand the weight he carried. But what made it harder was the loneliness. His friends had moved on, and his family didn't know how to reach him. The nightmares never left, and the memories stayed with him, even when he tried to forget. On that day, waiting by the bus stop, Thomas just wanted to get home. He wasn't looking for trouble. He wasn't looking for a fight. But life had a way of reminding him that no matter how hard he tried to leave his past behind, it always found him again. And this time, it found him in the form of a police officer who had no idea who he was or what he had been through. The police officer, Officer Davis, pulled up beside Thomas without a second thought. The car rolled to a slow stop and the engine hummed quietly. Davis didn't offer a greeting. Instead, he just watched Thomas for a moment, sizing him up as if trying to figure out if he was a threat. "Can I help you?" Thomas asked, his voice calm, though there was an edge of caution in it. Officer Davis didn't answer right away. He looked Thomas up and down, his eyes lingering on the veteran's worn jacket and tired expression. There was something about the way the officer looked at him that made Thomas uneasy. It wasn't the look of concern, but one of disdain. "You look like you've been through a lot," the officer finally said, his tone sharp. It wasn't a question, it was an accusation. "What are you doing here?" Thomas didn't respond right away. He didn't know what to say. He wasn't doing anything wrong. He was just waiting for a bus, something anyone could do, but Davis wasn't satisfied with his silence. "You a troublemaker?" Officer Davis asked, stepping out of the car and walking toward Thomas. Thomas stood tall, trying to hold on to the little bit of dignity he had left. "No, I'm not. I'm just waiting for the bus," he said, his voice steady, though his stomach twisted with tension. The officer's face twisted into a scowl. "Don't lie to me. I know your type." He took a step closer, his tone now threatening. "I don't like people who don't respect authority. You think you can just stand here without saying anything?" Thomas, trying to keep his composure, took a step back. "I'm not causing any trouble, officer. I'm just waiting." But Davis wasn't listening. He stepped forward again, his presence overpowering. "You think the world owes you something, huh? You think you deserve special treatment because of your service?" Thomas's chest tightened. He had dealt with his share of ignorance and misunderstanding, but something about the way the officer spoke, the harshness in his words, felt like an attack. Before he could respond, Davis reached for his handcuffs. The scene wasn't unnoticed. A few people had gathered around, drawn in by the exchange between Thomas and Officer Davis. Some were curious, others clearly uncomfortable, but most stood in silence. They watched, unsure whether to get involved. One woman, standing near the bus stop, couldn't hold back. "Hey!" she shouted, her voice trembling with anger. "Leave him alone. He's not doing anything wrong." Officer Davis barely looked at her. He was too focused on Thomas, who had his hands up now, trying to explain himself once again. "I'm just waiting for the bus," Thomas repeated, his voice shaky but firm. The woman's voice grew louder. "He's a veteran. He fought for this country, and you're treating him like this?" A couple of men stepped forward, clearly wanting to support the woman, but hesitated. They exchanged uncomfortable glances, clearly unsure if they should get involved in what was quickly turning into a tense situation. "I don't care who he is," Davis snapped, not bothering to look at the growing crowd. "He's not above the law. He's causing trouble. Now stay out of this." The tension in the air was thick. The woman looked at the bystanders, her eyes pleading for someone to step in. One of the men, a little older than the rest, finally spoke up. "This isn't right, officer. He's just a guy waiting for a bus." But Davis didn't care. His grip on the situation tightened and he continued to bark orders at Thomas. The small crowd stood still, divided in their response. Some wanted to stand up, but others seemed paralyzed by fear. It wasn't just the officer's aggression, it was the knowledge that speaking out might make them a target too. And so they watched, some with sympathy, others with regret, as the veteran's dignity was stripped away in front of them. The situation quickly spiraled out of control. Officer Davis wasn't interested in hearing Thomas anymore. With a sudden, sharp movement, he grabbed Thomas by the arm, yanking him toward the patrol car. "You're under arrest," Davis said, his voice cold and emotionless, "for obstruction of justice." Thomas barely had time to react. He felt the cold metal of the handcuffs click around his wrists, the tightness of them almost painful. His mind raced, but his body stayed still, trying to process the unfairness of it all. How did it come to this? He hadn't done anything wrong. He was just standing there, waiting. A few onlookers gasped, whispering amongst themselves. One woman tried to protest again, but Davis shot her a warning glance. She took a step back, retreating to the edge of the sidewalk. As the officer shoved Thomas into the back of the squad car, the weight of what was happening began to sink in. This wasn't just about a minor altercation. This was about something much deeper. The veteran wasn't just being mistreated by one officer. He was being treated like his service, his sacrifice, meant nothing. He had put his life on the line for this country, only to be ignored and harassed on the very streets he fought to protect. The arrest sparked outrage. News of the incident spread quickly through the small town. People began to talk, some in disbelief, others in anger. The local authorities couldn't ignore it for long. A petition was started. Social media posts and videos circulated, demanding justice for the veteran. It was clear that this wasn't going to be a case people could forget easily. The legal proceedings began soon after. The charge of obstruction was serious, and Thomas found himself sitting in a courtroom, feeling out of place in the unfamiliar surroundings. His lawyer stood beside him, making his case, while the prosecutor tried to paint Thomas as a troublemaker. But this wasn't just about the law. It was about something deeper. The treatment of veterans and the power dynamics that too often went unchallenged. The tension before the trial felt suffocating. Everyone knew this wasn't just any case. This was about right and wrong. It was about justice. The courtroom was filled with a tense quiet as both sides prepared for the trial. Thomas sat in the defendant's chair, his hands folded in his lap, trying to keep calm. The air was thick with anticipation. This wasn't just any trial. The whole town seemed to be watching, waiting to see how the judge would rule. On one side, there was Thomas and his lawyer. On the other, the police officer and his defense team, both ready to argue their case. The prosecutor, a sharp woman with a stern expression, began first. She painted a picture of a man who had resisted authority, someone who was quick to anger and unwilling to cooperate. She described how Thomas had ignored the officer's questions, how he had been uncooperative and disrespectful. It was clear she was trying to make Thomas seem like a danger, someone who needed to be controlled. Thomas's lawyer stood up next, calm and composed. He began by talking about Thomas's background, his years of service, the sacrifices he had made for his country. "This man," the lawyer said, his voice steady, "is a decorated veteran who has given his life for this country. He has earned the right to be treated with respect, not suspicion." He turned to the judge, his tone firm but respectful. "We are not here to contest the officer's duty to enforce the law, but we are here to challenge the way that duty was carried out. This was an unnecessary escalation. This was an abuse of power." The judge listened carefully, nodding slowly as Thomas's lawyer spoke. The prosecutor, however, wasn't convinced. "Respect has to be earned," she countered, "and in this case, the defendant didn't earn it. He was aggressive, disruptive, and disrespectful to a police officer who was simply doing his job." As the arguments went back and forth, Thomas sat quietly, his mind racing. His whole life had been about following orders, doing what was asked of him. But now, in this moment, the rules had shifted. It was no longer about orders, it was about justice. And as he listened to the arguments being made, he wondered if anyone would truly understand what he had been through. The tension in the courtroom was palpable as everyone waited for the judge to speak. Thomas sat motionless, his eyes fixed on the judge's bench, his heart pounding in his chest. The arguments had been made, the evidence presented. Now it was time for the judge to decide. The judge, an older man with silver hair and a stern face, took his time. He glanced down at the papers in front of him, then looked up at both sides. His expression was unreadable. For a moment it felt like time stood still. Finally, the judge cleared his throat. "I've listened carefully to both sides, I've heard the arguments, and I've considered the evidence. What happened here was an unfortunate series of events, and there's no doubt that both sides could have handled it differently." The room was quiet, everyone leaning in, waiting for the final words. "However," the judge continued, his voice firm, "the actions of Officer Davis were excessive. There is no justification for the way he treated Mr. before Thomas. No one should be subjected to that kind of behavior, regardless of their background. The law is meant to protect, not intimidate." Thomas's breath caught in his throat. He could hardly believe what he was hearing. He had expected this to go differently. But the judge wasn't done yet. "Officer Davis," the judge said, looking directly at the officer, "your conduct was unprofessional and unacceptable. I am ruling in favor of Mr. Thomas. The charges against him are dismissed, and you will face an internal investigation for your actions." The courtroom was silent, but Thomas could feel the weight of the moment. He had won. Justice had been served, not just for him, but for everyone who had ever been unfairly treated. The room was still, the judge's words hanging in the air like a heavy weight. Thomas couldn't move, couldn't breathe for a moment. The dismissal of the charges hit him like a wave, washing away the tension that had built up in his chest. But as the judge's gavel came down, the reality of what had just happened sank in. Officer Davis's face twisted in shock, then anger. His fists clenched at his sides, and he stood there, unable to comprehend what had just transpired. His arrogance had shattered in an instant. The public defeat was too much for him. The room felt colder as he stood motionless, his eyes glaring at the judge, then briefly meeting Thomas's. Thomas didn't flinch. He had been through too much to feel intimidated now. Instead, his gaze was steady, unwavering. For a moment, Davis just stood there, the weight of the verdict sinking in. His bravado melted away. Slowly, his shoulders slumped, and his hands trembled. The mask he had worn as an officer cracked, revealing the man underneath, defeated and unsure. Tears filled his eyes, a mix of humiliation and disbelief. His life was changing in that very moment. Thomas didn't say anything. He just watched quietly as the officer's emotional breakdown unfolded. It wasn't about revenge, it was about justice, and justice had been served. As the courtroom began to clear, Thomas stood up slowly, feeling a weight lift off his shoulders. The room buzzed with quiet conversations, but he barely noticed. His eyes were focused ahead, the cold air brushing against his face as he stepped out into the hallway. The outside world seemed brighter somehow, more alive. For the first time in a long while, he felt like a weight had been lifted, not just from his shoulders but from his heart. He hadn't expected this, hadn't dared to hope that things could go his way. But as he walked out of that courtroom, there was a small smile on his face, one that had been buried under years of struggles, under the weight of every unfair moment he'd ever faced. Thomas wasn't a hero. He wasn't looking for praise. But for the first time in years, he felt seen. He felt heard. The judge had not just ruled in his favor, he had acknowledged his worth, his service, and his right to be treated with dignity. As he walked out into the street, his steps felt a little lighter. There was still a long road ahead, but for now, he could breathe. And for a man like Thomas, that was enough.